November continues a film neo-noir vibe with replicants stealing secrets and manipulating memory, which means this week we take a closer look at threat models. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. S3 buckets open off the clouds of production. Misconfigurations giving up root near the container gate. All those models will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to dial up the news segment where cloud-native security manifests principles for its lifecycle. Bots go scanning for the secrets, heap overflows go automatic for the people, CPU security goes automatic for the processor, and more. Bring a Nexus 6 and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. By connecting to your code repository, Accurix generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, Accurix develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with Accurix at securityweekly.com/Accurix. In a fast-paced tech environment, the potential attack surface increases with each release and new app created. Detectify automates cutting-edge knowledge from trusted ethical hackers into the development pipeline for reliable application security. Go beyond the OWASP Top 10. Check your web apps for over 2,000 known vulnerabilities actively exploited in the wild, monitor subdomains for potential takeovers, and remediate security issues in staging and production. Learn more with a free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 131, recorded November 23rd, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, how are you doing? Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. I'm doing pretty well. We don't have Matt with us, but we do have someone who may be human or Cylon, who knows. But welcome to Adrian Sanabria. Hello, Adrian.
Hello. It's nice to be here.
Thanks for joining us, and we will be talking with you in just a moment, but first we have a brief announcement about our upcoming webcasts and technical trainings, how you can learn how to build a risk-based vulnerability management program, how to prevent phishing scams, and how to move beyond vulnerability scan to vulnerability fix. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. And that brings us to our deep dive segment this week. I mentioned in the opening about threat modeling, and part of this was motivated by the new manifesto, to continue some alliteration, that was just published this week. And the threat modeling manifesto is basically putting some principles and values more explicitly behind why to threat model. But before we get into that, just want to open it up with the idea that we're really talking about 4 key questions. What are we working on? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good enough job? Or how well did we do? And I'm just kind of curious to start this off at a high level. John or Adrian, how often have you encountered threat modeling or used threat modeling in your daily work or in the past work that you've done?
I'll take that.
So
go first.
jump in there. I run across it all the time. In fact, back when I was a PCI QSA, if you think about the process that we go through to do that, there's a lot of threat modeling involved. I mean, you do have the DSS, the standard, but as the QSA, you have to go through the organization, and there's a couple of processes you apply that really use the concept of threat modeling heavily. There's the data discovery process, in which you're looking to see if data exists where it shouldn't be. And in fact, in 100% of the clients that I worked with, we found credit card data in places that it shouldn't be. And even more so there's a process where you create a diagram. There's a data flow diagram process, and you map out the entire process that those credit card numbers, that payment data takes as it goes through the organization, looking for opportunities, attack surface, things like that, where attackers could come in, could get access to it, and also trying to apply the scope of the assessment to that. So it's good practice, for that organization and for the QSA to go through and kind of use this threat modeling skill set. Of course, I've used it in more traditional cases as well, but I was just thinking, that process actually applies a lot to what I did in PCI many years ago.
Yeah, and already you're giving to, if we're looking at some of the values of this threat modeling manifesto, one of the values is a culture of finding and fixing issues over checkbox compliance. And I think quite often PCI can be unfairly maligned as checkbox compliance, and what you're describing there is a way to use it to tease out important problems or and data leaks, if you will, credit cards showing up where they shouldn't be, which is part of also a journey of understanding, which is one of the values that the manifesto also calls out. So I'm curious. So already we've got a good start. John, I'm curious what your approach or what you've seen, how you've seen it recently or in the past.
And you're feeding my answer there, actually, by saying that, because I've looked at this both from a consultant point of view, in other words, walking into a company, sort of like, Idris is saying, and being able to guide a group through a modeling experiment, and then also with my own teams. And it's interesting how you think about that differently, right? It's one thing to be the new guy with new ideas coming into a team and saying, hey, let's try this different thing and see how you think about that after a few minutes, how it affects the way you think about the program you've been working on for the last multiple years. But when then compare that to when it's your own team, how do you get people that you've been working with day in, day out, that, you've got a very strict goal that you're trying to, get something out for a customer, and take a step back and go, okay, we need to slow down from doing that a little bit and think about, we're not just putting this out there for a customer, but also for those malicious actors. So how do we need to think about how are they going to look upon our new feature release, and what are they going to do with it? So it's been interesting to look at that from those two different aspects.
Yeah, and they're mapping that to the values that this manifesto is kind of highlighting. There's obviously that continuous refinement that you were speaking to, or there I think as well, about what are the new features. We can't just do a threat modeling once and then walk away. And one of the things that both of you have been talking about is this idea of people and collaboration, and talking with your developers, talking as a consultant to your clients. And a lot of it sounds like you've been focused on some process and methodology. But there's also that third word in there under values, which is tools. And I'm curious, have either of you come across tools that you found particularly useful as part of the threat modeling process or approach?
No.
Yeah, sure.
No.
So following up again on my PCI example, when you're creating that data flow diagram, it's not just interviewing folks. I've found you get a lot of maybes, especially when this process was built many, many years ago. So this isn't something you're doing during the development process. This is what they're using in code in production to do credit card transactions, things like that. So say it's a retail company. Typically, you'll find, the architects of it have left or they've forgotten entirely. Maybe documentation was created, maybe it wasn't. But I'll find myself, using packet captures quite extensively just to see, what these systems are talking to, where they're actually sending it. You have to peel through configuration files and things like that. Because there's a lot of, I think this is how it works, but going through that assessment, right, you have to go find out how it actually works. And again, I've got 100%, I'm going to report 100% rate of it not working the way that they thought it worked. So it's interesting coming in as a complete newbie, knowing nothing about this company, how anything works internally, and coming out with the most complete big picture conceptualization of how everything works in their company. Well,
Yeah,
not how everything works, but how this specific, very sensitive, very important process works.
Yes, and I think to your point, what are the relevant, what's our area of focus that we're talking about? Because everything can be a bit tough to do or could take quite a long time. One of the things too you talked about is sort of the tools, if you will, was more of the artifact of what's a useful outcome, meaning a data flow diagram, which if it is actually, we'll say mostly accurate, is actually a great outcome. That's a great artifact of the threat modeling process, just to figure out where data is going. But what's interesting is that you focus there on something to produce, a tool to produce as an output of the process, rather than something to manage the process, which I want to go back over to John. You just came out with that quick no. And why was that?
And it was being slightly snarky, but at the same time, I think it's honest. And to me, we were having a discussion on here a few weeks ago about DevSecOps tools and that type of thing, right? And to sort of look at that in a different light for threat modeling, I think the threat modeling tool itself is really, it's something that you would use to get to that data flow or to get to that, to the model of what you're actually trying to look at. So the reason I said no is do you need that tool? Does that tool have to be something you buy off the shelf or download from GitHub or something like that? Or is it something where you have a process in yourself that you've either come up with or you've taken from Microsoft or Mozilla or these different places that have a list out there? So I think if you want to consider a few questions of what have we changed, how does that affect what's public and what could be accessible? So if you want to think about that as a tool, I think there's some things out there. But personally, I prefer to focus more on with whoever that group of folks is that I'm working with. We're trying to get this sort of model in place, or this. We want to have a conversation about what are the potential threats that we're introducing into this application, and then based off of that, how do we sort of step through to that process? Is that a formal structure, or is that a conversation? So that's why I'm a little more flexible in how I do it.
Yeah, and I think I tend to agree with you that I know OWASP, Mozilla, Microsoft, they have produced tools to go through the exercise of threat modeling. But for me, I have that conversation. So, and I kind of wanted to highlight that aspect because one of the interesting things about this threat modeling manifesto is they also focus a little bit on sort of what not to do, or what is an anti-pattern that kind of takes you away from the direct purpose. So where Adrian was very well highlighting, let's have a data flow diagram. Let's figure out where the data is landing. And then also importantly, figure out if that reflects reality and tease out those areas that, here's a gap, here's something we need to fix. That's the idea that we don't need to build a perfect representation. That's one of the things they explicitly call out. Another thing they also that really spoke to me is the idea of the tendency to overfocus. And there I like to highlight the idea that just you and I last week, John, we were talking about some really cool CPU-based attacks, side channel power attacks and inference that even can go back to the Rowhammer style attacks from several years ago. But if you're deploying a new PHP web application into a container in your cloud service provider of choice, probably worrying about, power side channel attacks shouldn't be the most important thing you start with. You should be starting about the threats about, have we hardened the PHP interpreter enough? Have we given up root anywhere with our container? How are we handling some basic things? Do we have a framework for CSRF? How are we handling sessions? Things like that. And so that's where I really like to focus, and why I like how this manifesto is calling attention to that, to say, yes, we should enumerate all the threats, but the important aspect is what are the threats that are really important? And there, when we talk about threats that are important or clever, I'm curious, Adrian, are there particular ways when you go into threat model exercises you like to pick on a particular threat, just to start with, to get developers' mind thinking from a creative perspective?
Yeah, so me, one of the projects I've done over the years is analyzing breaches. So I think it's super important to not just take all threats, but to take relevant threats, stuff that we've seen actually happen in the wild, especially low-hanging fruit stuff we know attackers are going to go after. that at least gives you a starting point for where you should start coming up with these scenarios that you're going to run through, that you're going to think through in your threat modeling. And I think that's an excellent source for doing this, just using what you see in the news, what you see happening. And because there's so much stuff you could go through. And I've seen people go deep down the rabbit hole on something where, if you present that to a pen tester or a red team or somebody like that, they're going to say, yeah, that's never going to happen. You're wasting your time. You should be spending this elsewhere.
Absolutely. And I think what's a nice also byproduct of that, using a breach that happened to the news, sort of call it a pre-mortem or a tabletop exercise, if you will, it also kind of helps to point out, to say, rather than laugh at the other company that got breached and say, ha ha, look at those idiots, or who would ever do that type of misconfiguration, or who would ever write such a cross-site scripting or RCE into their code, you can say, well, what if it did happen to us? And it helps to make sure that we have not just a little bit of empathy, but also, I think, a bit healthier approach, just to say mistakes are going to happen. Yeah. Problems are, and what's the best way we can respond to them. And I'm curious too, from your perspective, John, if you've seen a particularly egregious breach or egregious problem that you've had to go back to talk with developers about, or maybe perhaps in the container space, kind of explain, here's the real threat we need to consider. It's great that we're thinking of this tool or this particular vulnerability, but we got to fix this thing first.
I just want to check first. If I remember right, this segment's only 30 minutes long, correct?
Sorry, you're only going to have to pick one.
It's, and I want to sort of, one thing on what Adrian was just saying, because the way you guys are talking about this, it also reminds me a little bit of MITRE's attack framework, right? So sometimes, there's an example of a tool which might be very handy in doing something like this. But, getting back to that question, two things that sort of come into my mind that they weren't too recent, so I can talk about them. They're actually really far ago. But something simple, like a lot of these type of things are like, okay, you're encrypting, cool. You're using a standard algorithm, cool. It needs to be assaulted. Are you assaulting it? Yes. What value are you assaulting it with? An empty string, right? So sometimes people have their hearts in the right places, but when you find something like that, okay, now that you've found that, exactly, perfect example back to what Alan was just talking about, Adrian was talking about, excuse me, is where else does that exist in the code, right? So sometimes when you do this threat model exercise, you might be doing it something like for a feature release or some little new tiny bit, but being able to take that particular example and go, okay, where else, what might we have been doing this type of thing in the rest of the application? That can be sort of handy to be able to go back and do that as well.
Yeah. Now I realize.
Yeah, and there's
go ahead.
If I can comment real quick. Yeah. So. Mentioning MITRE, there's actually MITRE Shield, where, again, the MITRE attack framework is a list of everything that could possibly happen, that an attacker could possibly do. And now MITRE Shield, they're actually taking, I believe it's Shield, where they're taking actual threat actors, scenarios that they're familiar with and applying them to the matrix so that you can see what techniques and what tools they're actually using. And just commenting on the encryption example there also, in many, many cases, we've seen where, yes, the box was checked, they're encrypting the data, but the private key is sitting right in the same file system in the same directory as the encrypted data, which isn't like you're kind of missing the point there.
Yeah, yes. Let's think about this more holistically. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about, and that's a lot easier to talk about, is what could go wrong. What are we working on? Let's just pick the web app, or pick our hardware product, or pick our IoT. What could go wrong, and then what can we do about it? We've been teasing around about different, fixing the encryption model, placing the how are we handling the secrets. But there's a fourth question in there, is that did we do good enough job, or how did we do? That one I tend to see not as well discussed, or perhaps a little bit that gets a little bit harder to quantify as in terms of metric of success. About, okay, we did some threat modeling, but was it worthwhile? So I'm going to continue my Thunderdome technique of moderation and just throw this out for the two of you. Did we do a good enough job? How do we approach that question?
I think I wish I saw a lot more of this. and this is super important. Not just it's good to do the thought process up front, but the way you learn really is by after you've done something. Okay, did I do a good job or not, either at work or whatever else? But it takes, again, we keep talking about previous episodes. Like I was saying, I think last week when we're looking at that that talk about, is DevSecOps useful or not? Like, okay, take a step back. What can I learn from this? Someone else either thought I made a mistake, or I am making a mistake, or there's a better way to do this that isn't going to land me, as I say, on the front page of the New York Times. So how can we actually go through and learn from that? I really wish more orgs did this. I've in some times where I've tried, I've been successful. Sometimes I've tried, and maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe people are too busy or whatever else. But being able to actually say, hey, I made a mistake. I'm not going to get fired. I'm not going to, no one's going to make a type of, pick your poison, any type of poison I would go be able to drink, but still, there's something I can learn and improve upon. So, Adrian, you're saying something. I think I almost cut you off. Maybe not.
Yeah. So sorry. So, I have a tab open here, and Alan Schimmel just started yelling at me through it. Sorry, it was one of the links we were looking at for today. Just random video just started. But so I think one of the important things with threat modeling is a lot of people tend to think about it as something that you do pre-production, during the initial development, first development, things like that. But I think it's worth thinking about when we use threat modeling. And I think the correct answer to that question is before, after, and in between. So, for example, if a big breach comes out, where there's a lot of details about how it happened, where there's something to learn from the company that failed, there's a great opportunity to go back through your threat modeling and try to answer that question of how did we do, and say, if this were us, would we have covered it? Did our initial threat modeling protect us against, the particular challenges that this one company saw in that breach?
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the aspects is that to go back a little bit to tools, I've seen people talk about threat modeling as code, or adding, documenting code with threat modeling concepts or threat modeling items, topics. But really, for me, it comes back to the idea of just sort of that agreement with John, in the sense of just have a document. And the how do we, or trying to answer that question, or building value over time, is also the idea of these documents can say, to Adrian's point, would we be protected in this if this breach happened to us? But quite often there is also an engineering trade-off. There's not, especially if we start to get into the user experience of applications, and how are we handling things like MFA or account recovery, or how long should a session duration be? Do we want it to be 30 minutes, 1 hour, or 8 hours? And if we've documented some of the reasons why we've made those decisions, or why the code is that way, in my mind, that's a great thing, because then we can go back after the fact and say, well, the threat environment has changed. We've seen a breach, or we've seen a new breach, or a new technique. Let's go back and check our assumptions and say, what were the assumptions when we initially had this discussion around this particular feature? Do those discussions actually match what was implemented? And if so, do we want to change now what we think about that feature? So for me, just having that ongoing conversation, so that's sort of that underlying theme of continuous, would be a good artifact of building this documentation and having these exercises. And they don't need to be really long. They don't need to be belabored, but they just need to exist and hopefully be revisited.
And that's part of why I was saying I don't care too much what the tool is, right? What I found, and I didn't say it before, but what I found is it's way more valuable to just start, it can be something actually written in your hand, and apparently that works better in a brain, or type or whiteboard or whatever you want. But once you actually get one or more people just getting stuff out of the head and put it down somewhere so you can have that conversation, that's way more valuable than waiting 10, 15 minutes or whatever it takes to actually find the best tool and then set it up and then get it working for your organization. And then, it's not working for Jira, so let's get that working too. And we have to get the workflow right. And, do it on get a Sharpie, do it on the wall, write it off clean it off before your wife notices, but first take a photo of it. Just keep it simple. And that, I think, a lot of times
documentation.
it gets to Yeah, exactly. And my new team workers are unfortunately realizing that I tend to be fond of docs, and I gripe a little bit when I don't see them. It could be in compliments, can be comments on your things, because exactly, it's I've been heard talk before about the 3 o'clock in the morning thing, right? You're coding away, you're happy, everything looks great. 2 weeks later, you look back and you're like, what did I write? And like, if you had actually just put even a few words, don't have to be sentences, just words about what you're doing and what the intention was here. um, it's useful for code, it's useful for overall thought process. I mean, Adrian, you're talking earlier before, if an architect leaves, and it comes right back to what Mike was just asking, is like, okay, well, why was this done the way it was done? Maybe there's a good reason, but do I have to waste 30, 45 minutes redoing that thought process to figure it out? Or can I easily build upon what's there? So it takes some time. We don't need perfect essays that are going to be, published immediately in the morning by O'Reilly, but put a little bit of something down so people can sort of figure it out.
Yeah, so there's a good example. Sorry to jump in there.
Yeah, go.
I love to use Equifax as an example here, because a lot of people have their idea of how they think Equifax happened and why that happened. And then if you dig into the details, which the reason I love using it as an example is we have tons and tons of details down to what the security culture is like, almost day by day, what they did, when they met, what they talked about. And if you go through all that, you find, I think most people's perception is that, Equifax got hacked because they neglected to patch struts. At least that was the initial intrusion point. And it was, but it wasn't because they neglected to patch struts. When you go through the details, they were aware of this vulnerability in struts almost immediately when it was announced. And they had meetings. They said, yeah, this is huge. We need to see if we have this anywhere. And they could not find it. So ultimately, there's a lot of things that you can point to in the Equifax breach. But the initial thing is that they failed to find struts to update it. They didn't have any documentation. The people that were around, these were legacy systems that were running this old version of struts, and they were exposed to the internet. But this is a company that had over 80,000 owned an IP space of over 80,000 IPs on the public internet. So that's a huge scale problem, keeping track of all that. And there was no documentation anywhere where they could just go and search the word struts and find where struts was used in their environment. Something as simple as a software asset inventory would have really saved their butts there, but they didn't have it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's one of the things that can be really Yes. And that's a great point, because it's really easy to say, oh, yes, we have an asset inventory or an application inventory. But doing a pre-mortem, it's a lot. We've talked before, alluded to the 5 whys, or say, why can we find that? Or would we really find that? Or is our own inventory of 80,000 IPs, even as accurate as we think it is? So that's a great point. And I think one of the final points I'd like to make about this is that we have actually been talking with a very software-focused perspective. But threat modeling can apply to processes as well. So talking about other breaches, there was a few months ago Twitter and the Twitter customer support or customer success, however you want to term it. They were attacked through a combination of technical but also non-technical means, meaning how can you exploit an account recovery process, or how can you take advantage of a customer success workflows? And these are things that do have technical aspects to them, but are still targeting processes. So threat modeling exercises, I think, are just as useful and just as important to not only run through with your DevOps teams, but with your customer success teams, with your perhaps other internal teams. It might be dealing with people, dealing with processes. So it just doesn't have to be code that we're fixing. And that's one of the final points I'd like to make. Don't know, John and Adrian. John, maybe you go first. If there's one other thing that you just really wish people would remember and think about when they dive into threat modeling.
How about it doesn't have to be a day-long episode? So one of the things we were talking about in our notes before the show, which caught my eye, was Mozilla's rapid, what did it call it here? The rapid risk assessment. Yeah. And I think this is really neat because it shows that you can do this process in 30, 60 minutes, right? So this isn't something that you have to go and send people to classes for and do a big sort of crazy complicated thing. I think one of the if there's a takeaway from what I'm saying that I want people to get over this last half hour is this can be done really easily. You don't need fancy tools. You don't need anything fancy. It's really a conversation that has an outcome of how can we make sure we're not exposing ourselves. So, keep it simple and low key. And that's sort of what my takeaway is.
So have we left any good takeaways for you to share with us, Adrian?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I actually have one queued up here. So one of my favorite resources for threat modeling, and really, you're more useful when you do threat modeling exercises when you understand the process better. And I think, in my experience, the more examples you have and the more disparate the examples, like you pointing out, this isn't just software, it can apply to process, the better you're going to understand it and the better your brain is going to be prepared for thinking through that process. So one of my favorite resources is actually the Car Hacking Handbook. The first chapter, and this is, you can view it for free. You can go to opengarages.org/handbook. And the very first chapter is called Understanding Threat Models. Even if you don't care anything about cars or hacking cars or anything like that, this chapter is the best I've seen threat modeling explained. And I think it's partly because they're using a car as the example there. And pretty much everybody's ridden in a car, driven a car. A lot of us in the tech industry and security industry understand a little bit more about cars, about how the technology in them works. And a car is a mix of hardware, software, and processes. And so I find a car is an excellent example for understanding threat modeling and walking through that process if you've never actually walked through the process before.
I think that's great, and we're absolutely going to have to throw that link into the show notes and drop it into the Discord so everybody can follow along. That's a great point. My car hacking was more Car Wars from Steve Jackson games, so I like this bit of reading that you've shared with us as well. But with that, I want to say thank you to John, thank you to Adrian, thank you for everyone listening to us. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.